Ready? Okay. Hi, and welcome to our 10:30 press conference, latest scientific results from the Mount Polley mine failure. Our participants are Ellen Pettigrew, Research Chair in Landscape Ecology at the University of Northern British Columbia, Phil Owens, Research Chair in Landscape Ecology at the University of Northern British Columbia, and Stephen Derry, Canada Research Chair in Northern Hydrometeorology at the University of Northern British Columbia.
Okay. Thanks, Nancy. The presentation today coincides with the publication of an article in the AGU journal, Geophysical Research Letters. And this paper that's coming out today reflects the research from 12 authors that have worked on Quenelle Lake in the past number of years, and as well followed the response of Quenelle Lake to the breach of a mining failure in the first 2 months from August through to October. So the three groups reflect a group of 5 researchers at the University of Northern British Columbia who work out of the Quenelle River Research Center, a group of 3 researchers from University of British Columbia, and a group of 4 Department of Fisheries and Oceans scientists who work on both fish and physical limnology in the Quenelle system. The lake itself is a large fjord lake, and it drains from the Caribou Mountains over here, and it drains down through the lake into the Quenelle River and then on into the Fraser River out to the Pacific Ocean. So this allows the link for anadromous salmon to come back and use the lake as both a nursery lake for the young as well as for spawning grounds, and the Mitchell River and the Horsefly River are both very active sites of salmon spawning regions. So the lake itself has high fisheries value, and not just for anadromous salmon, but also for sport fish such as rainbow trout. So the lake supports a recreational as well as a First Nations fishery. The location of the Quenelle River Research Center is here on Quenelle River, and a group of people work from there and have been studying the lake in the past along with our collaborators. You'll see also in the watershed that we have some mining activity. So the Imperial Metals has Mount Polley mine, and it was built several decades ago with the idea that it was self-contained, such that all of its waste went into this tailings pond. The idea was that, the watershed itself has some forestry going on in the area as well as some mining, but the lake itself is relatively pristine, being that it's large, 266 square kilometers, as well as quite deep, about 510 meters deep. So it has a large volume of water and has been very resilient to the small amount of disturbance in the watershed up to now. The Mount Polley mine footprint is shown here, and you can see this copper gold mine extraction has a large retention pond here, which is about 2.4 square kilometers, and it is bracketed between these 2 smaller lakes and was not connected to the larger Quenelle Lake itself. However, on August 4th, in the early morning of August 4th, the mine tailings, let's see if this gets going, there we go. On early morning of August 4th, the mine tailings wall breached, and here you see the hole in the wall, such that the pond drained, and it drained catastrophically downstream and emptied both the supernatant water as well as the mine tailings. So approximately 25 million cubic meters of material, both the mine tailings as well as construction materials from the wall itself, flowed out of the pond, and you can see here the opening. It went and blocked, material went into Polley Lake, the lake beside it here, and then continued, it blocked this lake, and then the material continued about 9 kilometers downstream and emptied into Quenelle Lake. The deposit in Quenelle Lake, you can see from this satellite image, the deposit from Quenelle Lake went 1.2 kilometers across the lake, was about 600 meters wide, and undulated between about 1 and 3 meters deep. So this was what you'd expect to have happen, is the heavy mine tailing material deposited onto the bottom, but what we were surprised at was the amount of debris that was in the water column, as well as material that didn't settle very quickly. Just to put this into scale for you, here's an example or a photograph of the Hazeltine Creek where the water and the materials scoured or moved downstream. And this creek in 2008 is about 2 meters wide. And then after the event, it's now 150 meters wide. And you can see that how much scour has happened in the watershed, in this creek bed, down into the glacial lacustrine material. So we have not just the 25 million cubic meters that we know of that came from the tailings pond itself, but also an unknown amount of scour material which has entered the lake. So the findings in the paper that we present, again, that was reflecting the first 2 months following the breach, indicated that the lake level rose about 7.7 centimeters due to the input of the material. And as well, we observed a 1 to 2.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature in the bottom waters of the lake. The turbidity increased in the west arm, which is where the material was deposited in the west basin, and we identified that the turbidity was held in the lower portion of the water column in the hypolimnion, and we started documenting that it was moving. As well, we identified the size of the material to be quite fine, and we were able to do a calculation of the approximate volume of material which was suspended in the water column in the west arm, or in the west basin. And then we recognized that the natural behavior of the lake in terms of its seshing or its rocking that is set up predominantly by wind-driven seshes was occurring such that we're starting to move the material not just downstream and out of the lake, but also upstream into the other arms of the lake and into the areas where both we have resident fish as well as potential spawning habitats. It is a copper and gold mine, so there were several different contaminants, many different contaminants that were entered into the lake, and we document some of the changes in the concentration of copper in the water column. So I'd like to just show some data quickly to explain how we came to some of these conclusions. And the lake has been instrumented in a number of different ways historically, and so we had background data to compare things to, but we had water level recorders installed in the lake, and you can see here that this is the August the 4th event, and you can see the large response in terms of water level change abruptly occurs on the evening or in night on August the 4th. This is a natural decrease in the level of water as the season continues. This is a close-up of that event, and we can see that the water level oscillated about 20 centimeters over about 12 hours as the water rocked in response to this big deposit of material, this 25 million cubic meters of water entering the lake. So this session was set up, and initially they had everybody take all their boats off the water because they weren't certain of the danger level, but people were on the water the next day and were able to get instrumentation in to do some measurements. This is a picture of Sam Albers, who's the manager of the Quenelle River Research Station, and what we did was we started to, again, this is where the deposit comes in at site 9 and 7, and we wanted to sample both downstream towards the town of Likely and into the Quenelle River, but also upstream and see what material was moving in that direction. These are some diagrams from the instrument that you saw Sam holding, the CTD, which measures conductivity, temperature, and depth. We also have a turbidity meter on it, and I'm showing here the graphs of the depth of approximately 100 meters that's in the West Basin, and I'm showing you the temperature profiles over time. These colors are different dates, as well as the turbidity in the water column. And what you'll see is that as you'd expect for natural in a lake in August and through September, you have a warmer surface water that cools as you come down to what's called the thermocline, and then the water should stay cool and approximately uniform temperature in the bottom waters. What we see here is that after the spill, we have an increase in water temperature of up to 2 degrees here. This is associated with high concentrations of particles in the water column, which shown as high turbidity. This high turbidity changes over time. You can see it gets lower concentrations of turbidity with depth, but the turbidity is kept below the changing temperature or the thermocline, so this plume of material is held in the bottom waters. And this is why it holds this thermally unstable water down below this. This water, being warmer, should be more buoyant, but in fact the particles allow it to stay there. So we've characterized the water column in a number of different ways, and one of the things that we looked at was the particle size in the water in the plume, in this turbidity plume. And we see that in several dates we have sediment that is very, very fine, which is why it's staying so long in suspension, and it's less than 1 micron in diameter. From our transects that we did using the CTD, we were able to plot the movement of this turbidity plume, and you can see from this diagram that was taken on the day that we flew the helicopter on the 6th of August that you can see the visible plume at the surface, but as we go through from August 6th through to October 2nd, we see that the plume gets focused in the bottom waters and gets held in the bottom waters, and it gets pushed not just out through the outlet as you'd expect here as to flow downstream, but because of the rocking of the lake and the natural seshing that occurs from wind-driven wind forcing, we end up pushing the water over the sill, and this process of seshing had been documented by Bernard Laval and the researchers Svein Vagel and Eddie Carmax from DFO in past years, and they were interested in this because of the way in which it affects the temperature of the water for fisheries. So this background research has informed the way in which we be able to track the plume moving. So what the paper really reflects is the physical limnology and some of the comparison of historical data to current data, the 2 months that we sampled post-spill. So with the physical limnology really informed what was going on with the material that was suspended in the water column, and Phil's going to talk about some of the sediment and quality and quantity in the water. But also important, and something that we're focusing on in the future, is the impact of both the physical limnology and the quality of the sediment on the biological response to the lake. Is the lake resilient enough, and the organisms in the lake resilient enough to handle the contaminant load that it received through this? So we'll be looking, investigating to see whether or not we have bioaccumulation or biomagnification. So I'll pass it over to Phil now.
Great, thanks very much, Ellen. So one of the things I'd like to talk about is the movement of the sediment plume from the lake into the Quenelle River System. And one of the ways that this came to our attention was a change in the water color. As you'll see here, this is a photograph of the Quenelle River just in front of the QRC research station. And you'll see here that there's a change of color to a very green hue. And that was associated with massive drops of water temperature of the order of about 10 degrees over a couple of days before returning to sort of ambient conditions. And that's very unusual and was reported to us by the local community as well. If we look also at the nature of the sediment, we found that not only did we see green water that was cold at certain times of the year, we also saw an increase in the amount of sediment in that water column in the river, and it was associated with a drop in the particle size to very fine material here, essentially clays and silts. And all these things are fairly consistent with what Ellen was talking about, with the idea that due to the rocking nature of the lake, that we get deep cold water impulses coming into the river system, and that deep cold water is below the thermocline into the epigenetic waters, and that's where the plume of potentially contaminated sediments and water was entering into the river system. And the reason that the size of the nature of the sediment is important is because very fine particles have a high specific surface area. And what I mean by that is it's the outside coating of the grains themselves. So if you look here, for example, if we were to look at coarse sand, for about a gram of coarse sand, we have a surface area of about 11 square centimeters. But if we look at very fine clay, for the same gram of sediment, we would have about 45,000 square centimeters of surface area, which is a lot more surface area for chemicals like metals to absorb onto. And as a consequence, it's the very fine sediments that most contaminants like metals tend to absorb onto. If we look at a longer time series of the suspended sediment in the river by the research station, going from about the time of the breach in August up to early in the new year here in January, what we see are these periods where we saw enhanced suspended sediment concentrations in the river, particularly in November and December and early in January, associated with the turnover of the lake. In terms of the nature of the sediment, again, we see a change into a different type of material that was associated with these pulses of water and sediment coming from deep in the lake. And in this particular indication here, in this graph here, what we see is minerogenic or inorganic sediment predominating over the more normal sort of blend of organic and mineral material. If we were to look at some of the metal concentrations on this sediment in the Quenelle River over this period of time, the important thing to know is the time where we saw this material coming from deep in the lake into the river system was also associated with high values of copper concentration. So here is where we see most of the water coming from deep in the lake into the river system, and we see copper concentrations of about 400 parts per million micrograms per gram. And to put that into some sort of context, the Canadian Sediment Quality Guideline for Aquatic Life, the severe effect level, which would be the level at which point we might see detrimental effects on biota, is about 110 parts per million. So clearly these values of 400 are very high in compared to what we might expect. One of the caveats I would like to raise, though, is obviously we need to look at the bioavailability of this metal values, because at the moment the values I presented here are total, and we need to assess the bioavailability, which would be the amount of that level of copper, for example, that might enter the food chain. We've also taken water samples from the lake water column itself, several locations, and this is a Van Dorn sampler which was used. If we look at depth profiles in the lake water column, and this is an illustration that Ellen gave a few minutes ago, we see that essentially this plume of fine sediment located at depth in the water column, typically below about 30 meters. And if we were to look at the copper of water samples taken down during the column, we see that at the surface, the copper values, waiting for this to return back to the previous slide, it's taken a long time. If we see at the surface, the levels of copper are very low, but at depth in the water column, the concentrations of copper are quite elevated. The important thing to note is that most of the copper seems to be associated with the total fraction as opposed to the dissolve, which would suggest that it's associated with the fine particulates that we see in the water column. We've also taken grab samples of the sediment at the bottom of the lake using an Ekman grab sampler, and here you can see 4 different samples of the sediment at the bottom of the lake. This is the sample that was collected where Hazeltine Creek comes into the lake, and then these 3 samples were taken either side. These 2 were taken at some distance up lake, and this one was taken down lake near the town of Likely. And this is typically the type of sort of sediment that you would expect at the bottom of the lake. It's brown, reflecting the fact that it's enriched in organic matter. But this sample here, which was collected just immediately in front of where the contaminated plume from the tailings entered the lake, is very grey in colour, reflecting the fact that it's very minerogenic. If we were to look at some of the values of the metals associated with this sediment, and I'm just waiting for it to come to the next slide, one of the things I'd like to point to you is these are metal concentrations along here, so 500 and 1,000 parts per million. First of all, I'd like to draw your attention to this green bar here, which reflects the copper values associated with material collected from the tailings. This was material supplied to us by the BC Ministry of the Environment. You'll see very high levels of copper, in this case 1,000 parts per million. If we look at these 2 values here, which represent the natural, if you like, sediment collected both towards Likely and towards Horsefly Bay. These were the brown sediment samples I showed you a few minutes ago. You'll see that moderately low concentrations of copper. This is the sample collected from near Hazeltine Creek at the bottom of the lake. Very high levels of copper, over 500 parts per million. And then these are the average values I showed you a little bit earlier on for the samples collected from the Quenelle River. And obviously the important thing to note is that these 3 sets of samples here from the mine tailings, from the bottom of the lake at near Hazeltine Creek, and from the Quenelle River are all considerably above sediment quality guidelines for aquatic life. And at this point, before moving over to Stefan Deary, I'd just like to acknowledge our funders and supporters for this research, and particularly acknowledge the BC Ministry of Environment and also the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Okay, over to Stefan.
Thank you very much, Phil. Just wanted to mention that we do have, UMBC operates the Quenelle River Research Center in the village of Likely. It is about 1 kilometer downstream from Quenelle Lake, and it's right on the Quenelle River, and it is essentially the home base for much of our research activities within the watershed. And indeed, there's a lot of research activity being held out of the Quenelle River Research Center. This includes aquatic research on rivers and lakes, landscape ecology, some work on fisheries, sediment and contaminant dynamics, as well as hydrology and climate, which is the focus of my own research. So here's a map of the Quenelle River watershed. It's a 12,000 square kilometer watershed that drains into the Fraser River. We do have glaciers in the headwaters, a wide range of elevations and different types of biogeoclimatic zones, I think 8 in total within the watershed. And right at the center of the watershed itself is actually Quenelle Lake at 266 square kilometers. We've been operating a network of meteorological stations within the watershed. Those are the yellow dots that you see on this map. And one is actually right at the QRC in Likely, but we also have high alpine weather stations as well, including one at point number 3, which is not too far off from Quenelle Lake itself, and has been in operation actually since 2006, and has been providing some really important meteorological data and useful in terms of our study that has been published today. Also wish to mention that there has been some moorings in operation in the lake historically as well, and that 5 additional ones were added following the breach of the tailings ponds at the Mount Polley mine. So there's 5 diamonds there that you see on the map, which represents those moorings. And here's a photograph showing the moorings themselves, and it really useful in terms of providing temperature and turbidity data within the lake itself. In terms of our own network of meteorological stations, we call them the Caribou Alpine Mesonet, or CAMNet. So it's a mesoscale network of meteorological stations. We have up to 10 now in operation. And this is really important because many parts of this watershed are extremely remote, and we do not have access to traditional networks of meteorological stations. So we've added some important meteorological data for otherwise an area that is not very well sampled. And part of the goal for our research is to look at climate change at high elevations, but also this provides data for such events as what happened at the Mount Polley mine this past summer. Just to give you an idea of the setup that we have for our meteorological stations in remote areas, we typically operate 3-meter masts, and they are operated by battery, and these batteries are essentially recharged by solar panels. We have wind monitors, and this was actually really useful in terms of interpreting some of the events that followed the breach at Mount Polley. But typically we also measure air temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure, we have precipitation, and snow depth and soil temperature. And just to give you a flavor of the meteorological data that we've collected, the bottom graph, actually the solid line shows wind at Brown Top Mountain right around the breach time and the couple months that followed, and the water level that Eleanor has already shown. So initially there was a SAISH event right in the lake, and you can see the oscillations of the water level at that time, but following that we've seen a couple other events in August and then in September, and these are related to wind events that we've experienced within the watershed. The red lines denote those wind events. So this is really important because now we can relate these SAISH events and the wind that generates those SAISH events with efflux of sediments from the lake into the Quenelle River System. So just to provide you some contact information, including those that are presenting today, for collaborating organizations as well, there's a list here, and the ministry in mind, people involved as well that you may be able to contact today. And what is next? Well, we'll continue to do some research to track what is happening in Quenelle Lake, and this includes redistribution of sediment and contaminants in the watershed, as well as biological impacts. So we're going to think long-term here. And we've applied for research grants and are looking for additional funding to continue our work. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to mention that the paper that was discussed will be online, is online in our virtual press room on the Joint Assembly Media Center. And, or you can email news@agu.org to get a copy. And now we'll open the floor for questions. Are there any questions from reporters in the room? I don't think so, but are there any questions from reporters on the chat?
There's a little bit of a delay in the video getting to the web, so therefore there's a little bit of delay for questions coming in from the chat. So let's give the people watching just a few minutes, if you don't mind. And I'll read any questions that I get. Okay. Our first question is from, I'm apologizing in advance for getting your name wrong, but it's Ferry Morali at CBC News. The question is, based on these initial findings, what will be the long-term environmental impacts of the Mount Polley spill?
The long-term impacts are what we're wanting to observe over the next 5 to 10 years. We know that the salmon cycle, the 4-year salmon cycle of the sockeye in the system are going to be critical to observe over this next little while. The salmon were returning to the lake in August. They were on their way up the Fraser River into the Quenelle system when the breach occurred and the flush of material initial flush of material came into the lake. Those salmon seem to have spawned very successfully, which I think 800,000 salmon, sockeye salmon, returned to the horsefly system, or maybe the full Quenelle system. And they, but what we are concerned about is that the juveniles from the year before were actually in the lake and were moving through the lake and through we have documentation of them moving in and out of the plume in the fall period. So we're concerned in the future about how this affects the biology. And our question really is how resilient is Quenelle Lake? Can we, is the lake big enough to handle this amount of material? What parts of the food web does this material get into, and is it biomagnified or is it bioaccumulated, or is it not? Is the lake going to be resilient enough to handle it?
Do we have any additional questions on the chat?
Okay, so this is a follow-up question from the same reporter. Can you expand more on how the waste materials now present in Quenelle Lake could create a potential hazard to the metal content of aquatic food webs?
At the moment, we are picking up some metals which seem to be elevated in the sediments. The question that we now need to look at in the immediate future, in the next few years, is how that contaminated sediment and those metals may get into the food web, as Ellen was alluding to. Again, that will take time for us to understand those connections between the different parts of the food chain. There is some indication through some of the zooplankton sampling that's been undertaken that there's already perhaps some elevated values in some of the zooplankton, but more work needs to be done. But it will take several years for us to really see how that permeates through the various trophic levels.
Are there additional questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. I believe that concludes our press conference. The next press conference is at 11:30, First Images of Thunder.